Austin is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Jurisprudence and Political Science at Amherst College. He has won awards for excellence in teaching and publishes profusely in the fields of law and political science. Austin has written a number of books, shared his wisdom and thoughts on the Supreme Court, on the death penalty, on democracy, and it's super timely that Austin visits with us post-election. Um, and a lot of us have all kinds of feelings about what's been going on. So the title of his presentation is Democracy Doomed? Question mark. And with that, I turn it over to my friend and fellow board member, Austin Sarat.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Emily, for all your work in organizing this. Thank you to Amherst Neighbors for sponsoring this series. I'd like to start with a poll. Here's the poll. How many of you love Zoom?
It's okay.
Okay, Larry, could you get Richard off the Zoom because he doesn't love it? I love I love Zoom. And one of the reasons I love Zoom is that it enables us to do what we are now doing, to enter into a space and hopefully have a conversation. It might be better to be physically present, but I must say for people my age, I do things on Zoom that I would never do if I had to go out in the cold. So I just want you to love Zoom as much as I do. And I make a recommendation to you. So I always find elevators awkward when someone else gets on an elevator. I don't know whether you're supposed to talk to them. So when an elevator gets crowded, I will just say out loud, I love Zoom. And that invariably starts a conversation. So if you're ever on an elevator and you're looking to start a conversation, just say, I love Zoom. Okay, so we did that poll. How many of you are worried that the Trump administration will do substantial damage to American democracy? Okay, you are my people. So my thesis today is, as we used to say in Providence, Rhode Island, irregardless of the Trump administration and what Trump does, the problems of American democracy will be there waiting on the other side. That Donald Trump is as much a symptom as a cause of the problems in American democracy. So that's the big thesis, and I'm going to try to illustrate that for you. That doesn't mean, in my view, that people should not be concerned with Trump and what he might do. But we need to keep our eyes on the ball. And the ball is that Trump is a symptom as much as a cause. And if we do not think about ways to address the symptom, then Trump and Trumpism will outlive Trump, so to speak, and democracy will end up being doomed. Now, it would be wonderful for me if all of those who are comfortable with doing so would turn on their cameras. Because when I look at these black spaces with names, I'm just reminded of what it will be like when I'm in a cemetery with black spaces and names. And I'm not eager for that reminder. So if you're able to do it, that is great. Thank you, Elise. So I have a question that I want to ask for Paul. Paul, will you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, sir.
Paul, if you were asked by, let's say, somebody, a young person, to explain why democracy is the best form or preferable form of government, what would you say? And I just need to exclude one answer. Winston Churchill's answer, it's the worst of all forms of government except all the rest, is unacceptable. So you can't use that one. So what would you say to a young person who asked you, interestingly, in a credulous way, why is democracy a good form of government? Paul, what would you say?
It creates the possibility that each one of us can have an influence over what happens where we live and how we pursue life, liberty, and happiness.
Good. And suppose that young person said, that's a fabulous answer, but why should everybody be able to have an influence, Paul?
In order for there to be harmony in our existence,
Yeah,
everyone should have a say or have a voice
good,
in that
good,
existence.
good. That is totally fabulous. By the way, I should have warned you that I teach at Amherst, so whatever you say, you're guaranteed at least an A- grade. So I should have said that at the beginning so everybody would be comfortable. That's a very interesting argument. Alas, unfortunately, the history of vibrant democracies is hardly a history of harmony. It's hardly that what democracy has produced when it's been its most vibrant is harmony. Indeed, though I like your answer, it's a kind of co-optation answer. Democracy is good because it'll make everybody be cooperative. It may very well be that we should love democracy, not because it produces harmony, but because it respects and encourages the articulation and expression of human difference. Now, if I wanted to impress you with my reading, I would refer you to a famous philosopher named Hannah Arendt. And that, what I've just given you, is kind of Arendt's defense of democracy. That what democracy does is to let us come together as equals so that we can express our differences. And that's for her, the greatness of democracy. Okay, that was pretty fabulous. I see someone down in the bottom of my screen with the name Allison. Allison, would you unmute yourself?
Okay.
No, it really, I know I make a bad first impression, but I'm really a nice guy. You'll be okay. So the question that I want to ask you is again a bit hypothetical, and if you'll tolerate it.
I don't know.
Well, again, just you listen, and if you don't want to answer it, you'll invoke your Fifth Amendment right against compulsory self-incrimination. The question that I want you all to think about is the following. If someone came to you and offered you the following choice, which choice would you make? Choice number one, you can be guaranteed to live in a society that achieves justice, but it will not necessarily be democratic. Or you can live in a society that will be guaranteed to be democratic, but it will not necessarily achieve justice. Which one do you think you would choose? Justice, not so much democracy. Democracy, maybe you don't achieve justice.
I think one would have to define justice.
Good. So I'm a liberal. That means I have no standards. So any definition will do. So what I would say to you is, to make the question meaningful, justice as you understand it. So we don't have to argue what is justice. So whatever you think of as a just society, it'll be guaranteed to you, but it won't necessarily be democratic.
That's a tricky one, because I think in
Yes.
my mind, I've always associated democracy with the potential, because of acknowledging differences, but having a voice, hope in the understanding of democracy that I would uphold, that it would achieve more often than not just solutions, just resolutions. But
Good.
I'm having my doubts.
Yeah, I love it. I love what you said, more often than not. So the people who founded the United States did not believe that democracy more often than not would produce justice. And they made reference to the classical democratic tradition. If you read the Federalist Papers, you see that people like Alexander Hamilton and John Jay and James Madison believed that the only democracy worth having would be one in which there were substantial and deep controls to ensure that democracy didn't produce injustice. Now, if I was a history professor, and I'm not, I would say that that explains why in the American Constitution, we have something called the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is a recognition that democracy left to its own devices does not necessarily produce justice or good results. Otherwise, you wouldn't need the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech, because we would just kind of know that the democracy would never abridge freedom of speech. John Stuart Mill, great English philosopher and one of history's greatest proponents of freedom of speech, was deeply suspicious of democracy. Now, Allison, what you said makes a lot of sense, and I've only given you one example, right? We were talking about justice, and I was talking about freedom of speech. So, here's my thesis. Americans do not have a very well-developed understanding of democracy. Young people in particular do not have a very well-developed understanding of democracy. And that problem, especially the problem that young people do not have a very well-developed understanding of democracy, may be why democracy is doomed in the United States. Now, if I were to walk around the Amherst campus and ask people the question that I asked you, democracy, justice, I would say that most of my students would choose justice, not democracy. That young people today, if they have any energy or left to commit to a civic, political, or social projects, are interested in justice, environmental justice, gender justice, racial justice, much more than they are interested in democracy. And after all, why should they be so interested in democracy, given what anybody 18, 19, 20 years old has lived through in the United States? So my thesis is, don't blame it all on Trump. The problems are there. He's a symptom as much as a cause. Number one. Number two, Americans do not really understand democracy, and for a very, very long time took it for granted. And young people in particular do not understand democracy and are much less attached to democracy than are people my age. Now, you say, well, Austin, I'm not going to stay on this Zoom with you much longer because it sounds like this is all a downer. And because I want to keep you here, I'm going to tell you what my solution to the problem is. Oh, I guess I'm supposed to have one, huh? Okay, so here's my solution to the problem. I'm going to try to identify as we go through some of the reasons why I think the foundations of democracy are unsteady. I don't know that I can do anything about all of those problems, but I know that there's something that I can do in my daily life, and that is practice what I call thinking democratically. Most of my friends who speak about democracy and who are committed to it do not think democratically. So let me tell you what I think are the attributes of thinking democratically. And you can do a little inventory. Like, how many of these attributes would you say apply to you? First, to think democratically is to be committed to telling the truth as you know it, but telling it in a way that it can be heard by others who don't already agree with you. If you simply tell the truth as you know it and you don't care about persuading others who don't already agree with you, I would say that's not a very democratic way of thinking. Second, to think democratically is to be genuinely curious about things that challenge your own beliefs. Democracy requires curiosity. Next, democracy requires a willingness to listen and a love of listening. When we speak and assert ourselves, and if that's all we're interested in doing is speaking and asserting ourselves, I would say that's not a particularly democratic way of being. Fourth, and I'm going to use a sports metaphor. I love sports. And I'm a little upset that the Red Sox have not signed a significant free agent, but maybe we'll leave that for another time. Here's the sports metaphor. Play the ball, not the person. You think democratically when you do not impugn others' motives with whom you disagree. Disagree with the argument. Do not attribute bad motives to the person. When you attribute bad motives to a person, I think that is antithetical to democratic life. Now, it's not to say that everybody has good motives, but if you want to participate in a democracy, you have to presume the goodwill of the people who oppose you. Next. By the way, do I sound like a rabbi? No, huh? Next. Empathy before criticism. Democracy requires a real commitment to trying to understand why people think, say, and act as they do. Michael Elliott, the good president of Amherst College, says, democracy is threatened by what he calls the rush to righteousness. Next, democracy requires humility. My favorite students are the ones that begin with the following. I could be wrong, but that's a democratic attitude. I could be wrong, but humility. And lastly, thinking democratically requires a love of losing, or at least a tolerance for losing. Because at the essence of democratic life is sometimes your side wins and sometimes your side loses. And you don't have to want to lose. Like, I really want to go out there and lose. That doesn't make any sense. But you have to understand that losing is essential to the vibrancy of democracy. So we may not be able to do anything about the macro problems that we're going to talk about in a minute, but everywhere you go, you can try to practice thinking democratically. In every interaction, in a private or public forum, you can try to practice thinking democratically, to tell the truth as you know it, but in a way that can be heard by others, to be curious, to play the ball, not the person, to listen. Okay, so now let's get to the bad. Now that I've told you the solution to the problems, let's get to the bad news. Are you ready for the bad news? By the way, that level of enthusiastic response is what I usually get in my own classrooms. So thank you very much for reminding me about that. Okay, I'm going to try to, way to go, Dick. I'm going to try to screen share. Here we go. Hopefully it works. Can you see that? Is that viewable?
Yes.
Okay, so democracy doesn't come from nowhere. It doesn't come from nowhere. And what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the conditions of democratic flourishing. So for democracy to flourish, we have to agree on fundamental political values. Namely, everybody gets a say, right, Paul? That's what you started us with, right? Everybody gets a say. Next, for democracy to flourish, government has to be seen to be effective and responsive to people's needs. I live in a town that seems to be completely unable to repair its roads. And if I care a lot about roads, and the government of the town is democratic, I'm going to begin to think, well, maybe this democracy isn't so good. Or I go to a hospital, let's not name any names, let's say Cooley Dickinson, and I wait 7 hours in the emergency room. Or I call up Social Security and I'm on hold for 45 minutes, and then there's a machine that screens me to decide whether I can talk to a live human being. So for democracy to flourish, we have to have a basic agreement on fundamentals, and the democratic government has to be reasonably effective. Number 3 is one of my big favorites. In a democracy, political conflict should focus mostly on middle range issues. When people's ways of life are seen to be at stake in democratic decisions, democracy is not going to work very well because they're not going to be willing to lose. So much better when democratic decisions are focused on what I call middle range issues. Number 4, are any of you old enough to remember Jacob Javits? Good. John Chafee? Let's see, who else can we remember? Richard Russell, John Stennis. So Jacob Javits and John Chafee were so-called liberal Republicans. And John Stennis and Richard Russell were so-called conservative Democrats. Democracy functions well when there are cross-cutting cleavages, when sometimes I'm with you and sometimes I'm against you. But I know that there are going to be times in the future when I'm going to want to be with you, cross-cutting cleavages. And if you have nothing to do later, go on your Google machine and look for graphic descriptions, graphic images of voting in Congress. The middle of the 20th century, the dots, the blue dots and the red dots completely interpenetrated. Today, it's like mitosis. I don't know what that is, but they're completely divided. Next, democracy functions best when the political parties are not ideological. Democracy functions best when we have high levels of participation, which we don't in the United States. I mentioned this one, democracy functions best when people are willing to lose, and democracy functions best when people have confidence in the government and faith in the political system. So this chart looks at responses to survey questions on the question of whether or not you trust the government to do what is right. In my worst nightmares, this looks like my TIAA, account over time. But what you can see is that in the middle of the 20th century, roughly 75% of the American people said that they trusted the government to do what is right, always or most of the time. And you notice that Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, that level of trust was pretty constant. You had a Republican and then you had Democrats. But notice, beginning with Richard Nixon, there's a kind of plunge in that trust. So 2020, the end of the Biden presidency, we're down to about 25% of the American people say they trust the government to do what is right. This illustrates the partisan divide in trust in government. Not surprisingly, when your team is in power, levels of trust tend to be higher. But notice how in every group, the levels of trust ratchet down. So under Biden, 33% of the American people, 29% say they have trust in American government. Go back to Lyndon Johnson, that number was 80% of the Democrats said they had trust in American government. Again, partisan divides. Democrats are more likely to be content with the federal government. Republicans are more likely to be angry with the federal government. And again, it kind of tracks whether your person is in the White House. Love this one, love this one. So the institutions that Americans trust the most: small business, the military, the police, the medical system. I want to know where these people live, because my trust in the medical system is not as high as this. But down at the bottom is the Congress of the United States. Presidency, 26%. The Supreme Court, 27% and falling. 8% in 2024 said they had confidence, trust in the Congress of the United States. Oh, this is fabulous. This is fabulous. Remember my thesis, Trump is a symptom as much as a cause. When it comes to US democracy, what is closest to your point of view? I've lost faith. 40% of the American public say that they've lost faith in American democracy. 6% said in this survey that they never had faith. If you want to live in a democracy, you have to have some confidence in the wisdom of the public. And as you can see, we're not doing very well on that. So in 1997, in this 35% said they didn't have much confidence in the American public. 64% said they did. Today, those figures have been flipped. So only 34% of the American public said they have trust and confidence in the wisdom of the American people. This chart just reiterates what we've been saying. How well is democracy working? 45% in this survey said not well at all. How about this one? If your preferred candidate ends up losing, would you accept the results as legitimate? By the way, I believe this poll was done in 2016. This is before in October of 2000, this is before the election of Donald Trump. You can see the figure, right? Only 31% said that they would definitely accept the result as legitimate, and roughly 28% said they would be unlikely or would definitely not accept the election result as legitimate before the election of Donald Trump. This is sort of hard to see. Regardless of political affiliation, do you think that the system of government needs major changes? So overall, 54% of the people in this survey said that they thought the system of government in the United States needs major changes. Dissatisfaction with American democracy, notice how it grows over time. From 1995, this particular data ended in 2020. Dissatisfaction has doubled in that period of time. This one truly is my favorite. This is the one that gets me up in the morning and gets me into class. So the question was asked, do you believe it is essential to live in a country that is governed democratically? And then the results were broken out by the birth date of the respondent. So looking just at the United States, we see that people born in the 1930s, 75% of them said it was essential to live in a society governed democratically. Come on, let's hear it for old people. No enthusiasm for old people. Notice people born in the 1980s, that number is down around 30%. And I believe that that number is even lower today, right? That's 1980s, people of 40 years old. So part of the problem of American democracy is that the people who are most supportive of American democracy tend to look more like me. And the people who are least supportive of American democracy tend to look more like my students. Okay, PowerPoint, do your thing. Young Americans are open to non-democratic rule. This is the same thing. Is it essential to live in a democracy? It's just with the arrow. So old people, yes. Young people, no. Support for democracy by age. Democracy is always preferable. People 18 to 29, 55% said yes. People over 64, 84% said yes. Voting participation by age. Young people participate the least. Old people participate the most. Freedom House, which is a group that sort of examines freedom and democracy around the world, said the following: while democracy in America remains robust by global standards, it has weakened significantly over the past 8 years. In terms of the strength of our democracy, we now rank below France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Do you remember him? In his farewell address, Barack Obama said, "Our Constitution is a remarkable, beautiful gift." For my purposes, I want to remind you of what he also said. He said, each citizen needs to be a jealous guardian of the Constitution of the United States. And that's part of what I mean by each of us needs to learn to think democratically and to practice it everywhere we go. Let me end the slideshow with the prediction of John Adams. John Adams said, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. What is happening in the United States today would have been unthinkable to people our age, my age, 75 years ago. America had not a perfect, but it had a relatively stable democratic form of government. And people could take democracy for granted. Why is it that people who grew up in the 30s and the 40s, or were born in the 30s and grew up in the 40s, were attached to democracy? Because they were real threats to democracy. They grew up with fascism, and then the next generation grew up with communism. Students, people who grew up after the fall of the Berlin Wall, could take democracy for granted. If you believe that thesis, then Donald Trump may be good for commitments to democracy, because he will remind us all that our democracy cannot be taken for granted. He will remind us all that the threat to democracy is just over the horizon. The problem is, as I hope those graphs illustrated, that many people in the United States are ready to see their democracy weakened and perhaps to let it go entirely. So we need to do everything that we can to rebuild the infrastructure of democracy, so to speak, brick by brick. At the level of policy, we need to be more inclusive. Stability in the mid-20th century, in part, was built on exclusion. We need to be more inclusive. We need to make sure that people's voices can be heard, even if they look and think very differently from us. We need to invest in ensuring that government is effective and support government and insist that it be effective. I have a 28-year-old son. I don't think that he thinks that he will live as well as I now live materially. And I don't think most of his friends think that they will live as well as their parents now live materially. If that's your definition of the American dream, then it's died in the United States. Again, go on the Google machine. People born in the 1940s, I think 75 or 80% of them ended up making more than their parents made by the time they were 30. Today, that number is infinitesimal. My son wanted to be an actor, and I made the mistake of encouraging his passions. Always a mistake in child rearing. Because I have a passion for Blue Cross and health insurance. So if you want to do something about American democracy, we have to make sure that the political system of the United States works for people. Last, we have a scandalous maldistribution of wealth and resources in the United States. Scandalous. And some of our public policies exacerbate it. I'm going to mention one. So I am teaching at 77 years old. No UPS driver that I know of is delivering UPS at 77 years old because the work is crushing physically. So lifting the mandatory retirement age, which has allowed me to continue to work, has lined my pockets in a way that is not available to people who do manual labor. You want to save American democracy? Do something about the scandal of inheritance. Wealth can be passed down. Do our kids earn it? No. Could it be put to better uses? In some cases, yes. So if we're really going to do something about saving the infrastructure of democracy, we have to make hard choices about things like income and wealth inequality. But as I said, we can't do necessarily everything about that, but we can practice democratic thinking everywhere we go. Okay, I'm eager for your questions and less eager for your disagreements.
Okay, so if you've got a thought, a comment, a question, this would be your opportunity. There may be some comments in the chat that we can peek at, but if you have a question, I think Elizabeth, although I know there's a nickname that
Buffy.
Buffy, take it away, get us going.
Okay, I understand, Austin, what you're saying about the need to really listen to across differences. Here's the thing I'm struggling with, and as you said earlier, I may be completely wrong, but the one thing that concerns me enormously is that there is no single truth anymore. There is so much purposeful disinformation out there. The big lie about the loss of the election. I mean, our economy was terrible. I mean, whatever, immigrants coming out of mental hospitals or whatever else Trump was saying. There was so much that the reality I exist in here, my belief in facts, the facts I thought I was teaching to, being empirical to my students.
Yeah,
Other people have a completely other set of facts. There's enormous, conspiracy theory, beliefs in conspiracy, all that. To me, that was a huge part of this election that is a real threat to democracy when we have no common sense set of facts anymore. So I just wondered what you think about that.
I think it's absolutely right. Again, I'm going to mention Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt said, differences of opinion only matter if we have a shared set of facts about which we are opining.
Mhm.
So yes, I think that's right. We know all of this, right? If you ask your students, do they read a newspaper? They look at you as if you're from Pluto. And I have a confession to make. When I get home at night, I turn on MSNBC, 6 o'clock, turn it off at 11. I hear the same thing, program after program, the same guests, program after program. To illustrate this point, I need to tell you about my crush on Rachel Maddow. So I've always thought Rachel Maddow was just wonderful as a news person. I found myself on a plane with Rachel Maddow. And I was sitting, I have to get to the airport 6 hours early. I have to be the first one on the plane, I have to get my bags in. And I'm sitting there, first one, bags up. And I look up and who's coming towards me but Rachel Maddow. And I thought, oh my God, there is a God in heaven. And she is going to deliver Rachel Maddow to me. But she didn't. She put Rachel Maddow in the seat in front of me. And so I was flying to Washington, D.C., and I'm thinking, how am I going to do this? So it was one of these little commuter planes. And everybody stood up and there's this crush. And Rachel Maddow kind of was turned 3/4 towards me. And I thought, this is my opportunity to use the skill that I developed in high school. So I said to her, if I help you with your bags, will you talk to me? And she laughed. I helped her with her bags. I walked her through Reagan National Airport. I'm getting to the point of the story. At one point, I said to her, you are the Walter Cronkite of our generation. And she said, making your point, there are no Walter Cronkites of our generation. Now, part of the story I'm trying to tell us is the loss of confidence in all institutions, including the media, makes it harder to have a common set of facts, like where they're going to come from. What people like me, I wrote, 1.5 million op-eds pointing out how Donald Trump lied. And what I didn't understand was that many of his supporters knew that he lied and either didn't care or said, he's our liar. Last point, not about information, but about this segregation or division. When I grew up in a seriously Jewish family. My grandfather worried a lot that someone would marry outside of the faith. Today, people are much more likely to worry that their child will marry someone of an opposite political party. That means political differences in the United States have taken on a theological quality. Remember, play the ball, not the person. If you play the ball, then you have an opponent. If you play the person, then you have an enemy. And in the United States today, opposition is too often converted into, that's a bad person. That's my enemy. In which case, all I want to hear is things that reinforce me. And don't require me to talk to people who don't already agree with me. Sarat, I think you're next.
Unmute. You got to unmute, Saren.
Okay, my personal opinion about the biggest danger to democracy is the racism and feminism that is existing in this country at this day and age. So, how do we beat this? In my opinion, there was no doubt in my mind, but Kamala was the best equipped person to provide all the people was interested in. Did she even direct the conversation to them? No, nobody listened because she's a Asian American woman. So how do we get over this big danger in our society?
So I have a question. Have any of you had your minds changed if someone said you are a racist? I know no one who has had their mind changed when they were, was pointed out to them that they are a racist or a
But nobody admits that they are racist. That's the thing.
Just bear with me.
Yeah.
So if I want to address the problem of racism or sexism or transphobia, I need to think about how do I speak to or address the people who hold those attitudes? Now, I can condemn them, and they deserve condemnation. But my project is I want to convert them. And that's why I say, thinking democratically, you have to tell the truth as you know it, but to tell the truth so that it can be heard by others. Now, I don't underestimate, far from it, the virulence of racism and sexism and homophobia in our society. I don't. But I think that the way we have to address it is first to understand it. Some of it is not something that we can grapple with through reason and argument. But I think our first task is to understand it. And what I believe is that empathy is not the same thing as sympathy. I don't sympathize with people who are racist or sexist or homophobic. But democracy requires that I try to understand the world through their eyes. Doesn't mean I'm going to accept the world through their eyes. One last story, Sarah, which is not directly responsive about racism and sexism. So I work on the death penalty in the United States. Death penalty is a lot about race. 30, 40 years ago, 80% of the American public supported the death penalty. And abolitionists, people like me, used to go around saying to people who supported the death penalty is immoral. That converted nobody. Today, about 50% support the death penalty, and death sentences are way, way down across the country. Why? Because abolitionists found a way of giving people a place to stand that would allow them to change their mind. Oh, you're in favor of the death penalty. Are you against executing the innocent? Yes, I am. Oh, you're in favor of the death penalty. Are you in favor of giving people death sentences because of the race of their victim? No. Are you in favor of giving people death sentences because of the quality of their lawyers? No. So by shifting from accusation to another kind of register, you can be against the death penalty. But let's find a place where you have a place to stand. As hard as that is for the death penalty it's impossibly difficult when we talk about ingrained attitudes around race, gender, or sexuality.
Cynthia, and then Richard.
There. Am I unmuted?
You're good, yeah.
Okay. Great talk. I wanted to ask something general and something specific, and they could be tied together. One is in your list on your slideshow, it said finding the middle range on issues, to focus on those rather than one side or the other. Could you make more, give an example of that,
Yep.
for instance? And the
Yep.
other is that I feel like we're the glue that has held us together as a nation. It seems to be going away or gone.
Yep.
And so how do we get that back, or what can
Good.
we do to get that back?
Good. Well, I've given you my prescription for how to get it back. And how to get it back is to practice thinking democratically, to approach people that you don't agree with curiosity, a desire to learn from them. I don't own a gun. I can't imagine owning a gun. But I'm not going to make a lot of progress on gun control unless I can understand why people are so attached to their guns. Now, you said middle range. That was my example about the death penalty.
Oh,
So that was to convert from an existent, you are evil if you support the death penalty, to say, here's an issue about which we can maybe agree. Now, I want to remind us of something. Many, 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 many people on all sides of the political divide regard themselves as victims. And lots of people have been treated with incredible injustice and have been victimized. But democracy requires, wherever we can, to turn down the heat. That's why the rush to righteousness may make us feel good. It may be good at building up our team, but it's not very good for democracy. Now, again, I don't want you to mishear me. I'm not saying that injustices should be ignored. I'm not saying that inequality should just be accepted. I'm saying that if we want to live in a democratic society, we have to find ways to turn down the heat, not to turn opponents into enemies. And we aren't very good at that. And by the way, that is as true for people who hold my political views as it is for people who don't. Democracy is threatened by authoritarianism. It is also threatened by progressive illiberalism. So I think we all have to step up to the plate. Again, not all equally. I'm not saying that societies, the people that have been on the downside of injustice for decades or centuries, bear the same responsibility that privileged people do. But all of us, where we can, need to play the ball, not the person. Professor Goldsby, it's wonderful to see you.
You got to unmute, please. There you go.
It's very good to be here and to hear and see you, Austin.
Nice to see you.
But I think you gave us a bad deal when you started off by giving us a binary choice, democracy or justice.
Yeah.
I mean, even light knows that it's neither particle nor wave, it's both.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you can't give young people a place to stand by offering them not just democracy or not just justice, but by offering them democracy and justice.
Nope. I'm sorry, I can't do it quite in the way you want me to do it. So if I was asked to
Humor
defend,
me, I'm an old person, I'm 90. Give me what I'd like.
I'll be by with some soft food in a little while. So we're in what my mother used to call heated agreement almost. So if I was asked the question that I started with, why is democracy the best form of government? This is the answer I would give. It is the only form of government that respects our natural political equality. No one has a right to rule over me naturally. And that's a claim about justice. And what I tell my students is you can't get to democracy democratically. Why should we have democracy? Let's have a vote. Well, the answer is, why should we vote? So you have to have a principle before you can have a commitment to a principle before you can have democracy. Democracy depends upon a principle, and it is a principle of justice. And that is that all of us are equal politically. What does that mean? And I loved the answer that, right, I got earlier when I said, would you choose justice or would you choose democracy? And the answer was, well, it depends on what justice means. So part of the joy of democracy is the opportunity to argue about what justice means. Democracy doesn't guarantee that we'll get to justice. Democracy guarantees that we'll have an opportunity to discuss it and to try to convince others of what we see the just to be. And the greatest champions of rights in the United States have understood that. They've understood that the way to deal with inequity and the way to make progress in the quest for justice is to build the biggest army that you could. But that doesn't mean that justice is going to reveal itself. It doesn't. We're going to argue about it. And I believe, like you do, that democracy gives us the best a chance to achieve justice. But we all know the many, many instances in this country and elsewhere where democratic politics did not produce justice. So what I say to my students is, if you're interested in gender justice, racial justice, whatever justice you're interested in, you need to preserve democracy. Because without it, you have no chance of getting it. With it, you have no guarantee of getting it. So democracy is a risk. But it's the only way that I know of to have a chance to achieve justice. It cannot guarantee it. Allison, you're back.
I'm back. You didn't scare me off totally.
Good. Give me 5. Good.
And this is not my best area of my expertise area, but a couple of things have come up for me in this discussion, which I think is fascinating. I resonate a lot with what you're saying, and I witnessed a lot of what you're saying about progressive illiberalism. I have millennials and a lot of friends, and we've had a lot of arguments, but the couple of questions that come up. One is when we're talking about democracy, and we mentioned other nations, there's also different forms or ways that democracy has been implemented.
Yeah.
And our system, like you mentioned, the Bill of Rights, which in a way is also a value, setting up a set of values that were put into the Constitution for a purpose. So I see perhaps, and I'm wondering that perhaps one of the problems is we don't not only can't we agree on facts and all, what values, what is really
Good.
most important.
Good.
And if we can't get alignment on that, it is difficult to get alignment on the others. So I wanted to speak speak to that. The other part is that at the place we're out now, with electoral college, with gerrymandering, with the Supreme Court, a lot of the checks and balances and values that were supposedly, or we thought maybe embedded in the Constitution, seem to me almost to be being thrown out. So the concern I have is the United States, in a way, whether it was always really always legitimately or acting in this way of democracy and the values we sort of say we have, still it was a force against some of the other things like fascism and authoritarianism. Once the way we're going, where we're aligning, who is going to uphold that outside if we lose it from within?
So I love your questions. 70 million of my fellow Americans voted for Donald Trump. 70 million people. Why? There are a variety of reasons. They cared more about dealing with inflation than they care about democracy. When I say that sentence, I really just want to faint. They care more about dealing with inflation than they do about democracy. But that's a reality on the ground. I said to the president of Amherst melodramatically after the election, this election is a vote of no confidence in places like Amherst College. We are so out of touch with the lives of people that live in Palmer or Bondsville or Pawtucket, Rhode Island. I said to him, Amherst abolished fraternities only to become one itself. We now have secret handshakes and secret words and codes that only we speak, and no other human being would ever use these words. So to understand what's happened in America, we have to understand this deep, deep cultural divide, which is associated with education. The Democratic Party used to be my grandfather's party. My grandfather was a carpenter. Now it's the party of the coastal elites, the highly educated coastal elites. So we have deep values divides. The Bill of Rights, I don't think was about values so much as a recognition that we couldn't trust the people with certain things. So I think the Bill of Rights is a miracle of democratic self-restraint. We, all of us, are going to agree that we're not going to make laws restricting freedom of speech or religion or the right to assemble. We, all of us, agree that as much as we want to, we're never going to punish cruelly. So that democratic self-restraint, I think, is kind of that's this rush to righteousness. That's why I say we need to deal with it and contain it and be a little more humble. Next.
It doesn't seem like some of those are at this point a lot of people are not interested in upholding some of those things. I also agree that, in terms of, I traveled across country and I've been in a lot of different communities having a lot of discussions and all, that a lot of it is to what you say, going back to what we can agree on, which, we all want safety. We want to be able to live in a way that we have our basic needs at least met. I mean, there are a lot of things that we could agree on, and I do think we need to move back to addressing those, not just ideological concerns. But the fact is, if we no longer have institutions or people, like if we land up, our media is usurped and we cannot get even alternative views. The Supreme Court is a real concern. How do we get back to having democratic discussions? I mean, we might not be allowed to have those.
Good.
And if we don't have a weapon, we might be killed by those who don't care. They just don't care.
Yeah, I hear what you say. And in the extreme, nothing I said is going to matter. Am I afraid? Yes. But I think we've got a long way between us and they're coming to knock on my door. I'm more worried about Hungary than I am about Nazi Germany. I'm more worried about illiberal democracies than I am about the fascists going to come down the street. So you've asked the question that I'm trying to answer. rebuild democracy brick by brick. You're not going to save democracy if people don't want it.
So does that go back to the thing about education and
goes
especially with
back
the
to-
youngster
Goes
and
back
civil?
to,
We don't have a lot of civic
it
education.
goes back to thinking democratically. It goes back to stop condemning people and try to understand them. It goes back to address real problems like inequality in the United States. I'll give you a case. This is a classic destroy democracy case. It was called the Masterpiece Baker case. Colorado enacted an anti-discrimination law, as it should, which prohibited discrimination against gays and lesbians. A gay and lesbian couple came into a bakery and wanted the baker to bake a wedding cake. The wedding cake, the baker refused, citing their religious principles. Now, for the moment, let's imagine that that was a sincere expression. What do? So if you say, we don't care about your religion, you've got to bake the cake, what do you produce? You produce religious resentment. If you don't honor the claim, the rightful claim of the gay and lesbian couple to have equal access to services, then what do you produce? You produce resentment. So there are going to be some conflicts which are like that, where you're either going to get the cake or you're not going to get the cake. But too often people say about that, for example, that's an expression of religious bigotry. And then we create enemies, not just opponents. So I think the way we preserve American democracy is by rebuilding it brick by brick. I'm worried about the chart that shows, I believe it's essential to live in a democracy, going down. That's what I think we need to work on. And it's not just an educational project in the sense of I go into class and I teach students about democracy. It's a civic project.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm going to pick on Amherst. I love Amherst. I do, and I'm privileged to be involved in the public life of Amherst. But I am tired of being called names. I'm not tired of being told I'm wrong. I love it. But I'm tired of being called names. People on the school committee, for right or wrong, were driven out of public service because they were called names. So a little less name calling and a little less, you're wrong. This is wrong, is what I think will rebuild democracy. A little more effort to understand and empathize with people who support people. I can't imagine voting for Donald Trump. So I can just write off those 70 million people. That's not going to help democracy. Or I can try to rebuild it brick by brick in every conversation that I have. That's the only solution I know for us. Nancy.
Nancy Barry, unmute yourself, please.
Got it. So I, at the risk of sounding naive, which I've never been too afraid of being called, I think that this list of rebuilding democracy skills is absolutely wonderful, but I also think it's really hard.
Yeah,
And I am not sure that the blue people are any better at it than the red people
I
are.
agree.
So I think it's going to be, I'm not quite sure I see the path, because I have been actually trying to do many of these things throughout my life, and maybe I've made a little progress, but you know, it's really tough. But my real question is, just because we're so polarized right now and in deep division, is that by itself a reason to feel like democracy is doomed?
So division is not the enemy of democracy. That's what I said earlier about, well, people will cooperate. Division is the lifeblood of democracy. The question
How
is,
have we've turned it into somehow?
because So there's a wonderful article that I really like on political sectarianism. This man's argument is that we used to argue. We're now in camps, religious-like camps, because we regard the other side as iniquitous. We regard the other side as immoral. So if that's what takes division and turns it into enemy camps. Now, what you started with made me so happy, because you said this is hard. It is. No guarantee of success. Am I going to be able to persuade people by just saying it in a way that they can hear? No, that's not guaranteed. But without it, all we have is a kind of civil war. And when the time comes, I'll go to the barricades. But in the meantime, I want to try to rebuild democracy so that the next time people are faced with a choice, they'll think democracy is actually worth preserving. We are a long way from that right now. And we can point the finger of blame, by the way, I agree with this, at the media or at disinformation, all true. But that lets me off the hook. The question is, what am I going to do to try to preserve and improve democracy? Democracy in the United States and elsewhere needs a lot of freshen up. So that's what I think. And I loved what you said. It's hard. And it goes back to what Richard Goldsby said to me. There's no guarantee that it's going to work. But without it, I don't see that there's a bright future for democracy in the United States because of all the slides I showed you. You got to get people to trust in each other, trust in each other's wisdom. And that requires patience, hard work. And the one thing I didn't say is it requires faith. And I'm going to say what I mean by that. So I've been lucky to teach at Amherst College for a long time. Other than Buffy Aries and Dick Goldsby, the best teacher at Amherst College that I ever encountered was a man named George Kateb. George Kateb was a mentor of mine. He was a political scientist. And, you know, I worshiped him and thought he understood everything. There was a direct line from God to George. And George Kateb said to me once about teaching, he said, never make eye contact with your students. I thought, boy, that's very Zen. What does that mean, never make eye contact with my students? He says, your job is not just to see them for who they are, your job is to see them for what they can be.
Mhm.
That's a democratic credo. I think democracy requires faith, right? Faith. It's a risk. It's like children. You have children and they disappoint you and you don't give up on them. By the way, my family therapy rates are very high. You don't give up on them. You have faith. And
I'm
that's why I
thinking-
think we have to think about our fellow citizens. I mean, again, I've said this in public. I love the fact that people in this town are pushing really hard to stop me from getting something that I think is absolutely right for the town. I love it because it represents what I call a democratic commitment. And that's what we all have to do. We have to be in there doing what we can do in the best ways we can do it and making sure that what we're talking about is a conflict, not a ideological, existential, end of the world, good guys, bad guys thing.
So Austin, where have you published your list of what democracy requires? And if you do publish it in the future, could you move number 6 higher?
Well, if you would tell me, so I could remember what number 6 was.
Humility.
Oh, no. That humility stuff is too hard for me.
Yeah,
So I have a book to recommend, and it's not mine.
okay.
It's a book by a Harvard political theorist named Michael Sandel. And it's called, I think, The Tyranny of Merit. This is really terrible. I should not be recommending other people's books. I have a book called Divorce Lawyers and Their Clients, if you're interested in that. That won't help you on democracy, but The Tyranny of Merit, it's either The Tyranny of Merit or The Tyranny of Meritocracy.
Uh,
And Michael Sandel argues the following, that a lot of what has put America in the bad position it is resentment. And that elites in the society have been too self-congratulatory. We know best for everybody. And he has, I think, a really interesting set of arguments about the practices of humility and their place in democracy. So if you're interested, that's a place I would go.
I'll look, thank you.
Thank you,
Dick,
Dick.
Dick has his hand up.
Yep, Dick.
Thank you. I'm not sure I have as much confidence. I hope that you're right, that we're looking towards worst case of Hungary and not Nazi Germany. I'm not so sure. I mean, one of my major concerns that you haven't addressed is the risk that Trump comes fairly soon, works hard on oppression, and whether he's got the tools of the military, the National Guard, and the militias, and the self-organized militias. And my concern is he comes out of the gate fast with some show stuff about immigration, and then there's protests, and then one of those instruments is used to kill some protesters,
Yep.
and everybody is afraid to go into the street. What are you thinking about that issue?
I think it's happening. I think it's happening around us. It's happening with the media. So you want Donald Trump to sue you for defamation or libel? So do you want him to withdraw contracts from the business that you run? No, so we're not going to publish that editorial. Timothy Snyder calls it obedience in advance. So I think we're already seeing it. Look, again, it does sound theological. There's another word that I think is called for, and that's courage. And let me tell you something, I'm not a leading possessor of courage, but I think when I write what I write, I think, oh my God, I'm putting myself at risk. So I fully agree with you. So I hope Larry will invite me back for my next Amherst Neighbors appearance on the Insurrection Act. So we have this thing called the Insurrection Act dated from 1803. Donald Trump could, under the terms of the Insurrection Act, call out the American military. So yeah, there's dangers. It's really dangerous. I don't underestimate, maybe you think I do underestimate the danger because I'm thinking about Hungary, not the Nazis. But that's where I think we are. Could I be wrong? Yes. It could be much worse, much more quickly than I imagine it to be. And what was said before, I totally agree with. So I want to tell you that I specialize in, I think I gave a talk on this, but not here, somewhere else, on the worst Supreme Court decisions.
It was here.
Well, I hope you'll invite me back to give a talk on the presidential immunity decision.
Absolutely.
It is just, it's more complicated than we think because that decision does not grant immunity to anybody else. So if Trump wants to enlist me in doing something criminal, he's safe, but I'm not. Now, if you really want to be a pessimist, you say, yes, Austin, that's true, but he has the power to pardon you. So, yeah, we live in dangerous times. Michael Walzer wrote a great book called Exodus and Revolution. Great book. I highly recommend it. Not as much as divorce lawyers and their clients, but good. It's good. Michael Walzer says the journey to justice is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And you never know how far back that 1 step is going to take you. But that's all we got. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Faith and courage, never making eye contact, always seeing what can be and committing yourself to that. That's what I do in a classroom every day. Anybody who's ever been in a classroom knows how boring it is to work with 19-year-olds. That's what I tell them on the first day. But you see them for what they are, and you help them become what they can become. And that's what I think the work of citizenship is. Okay, next question. Let me tell my sweet love I'm on a Zoom. Hold on. Well, he left me. All right, Kip.
We're down to the last minute or so. If
All right,
there's
Kip, ask a quick question.
okay,
I'll
Kip,
keep it quick.
Yeah, go
Okay,
ahead.
quick.
Last question.
Professor, I thank you very much for the presentation and talk. A lot to process there. But my question has to do with your indomitable skills at forecasting the future. And I'm wondering if you care to step into the ring and comment on what America might look like after 4 more years of Trump.
So some of my answer is, it depends on what we do. It depends on what he does. So I need to say the following. I wish him great success as the president, and I hope he fails miserably. So some people that study these things think Americans treat their politicians the way some young people treat their dates. They're fickle. They like them for a while, and then they trade them in. So if that's right, Donald Trump will soon be in trouble because Americans are fickle. That's the optimistic view. The pessimistic view is he will find someone to blame it on. So I think that America 4 years from now may not look a lot like what America did when I cried on my sofa when Barack Obama was elected. But I think that democracy is worth fighting for. And I, for one, plan to be in the fight for as long as I can, and to fight in the ways that I can. And that's what I've tried to talk to you about today. So by the way, Larry, I love you, but you kept me up well past my nap time. So nice to see you all. Thank you very much. I'm going to share with you my new New Year's greeting. I wish people now a healthy, happy, and democratic New Year.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Austin Sarat, for an outstanding
Thank you.
presentation. A record-setting number of participants, somewhere north of 60, actually, and a stimulating conversation. As you sign off, folks, there may be a very brief, takes about 5 to 10 seconds to answer a couple questions. That helps give us feedback on our programs. We will definitely have Austin back again in the future because he's really good at what he does.
Remember, as you fill that thing out, the only acceptable grade at Amherst is A- or above.
All righty. Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You.
It's definitely good.